Daniel is currently an assistant professor of Sepharadic and Iranian studies at Yeshiva University. He studied here at Yale University in the Department of History. His work focuses mainly on modern Iranian history. He's also a scholar and knowledgeable in the area of Shia Islam and Iran's religious minorities, or the place of Iran's religious minorities. He did his studies, as I said, at Yale, did his PhD at Yale. He was also a scholar at Tel Aviv University and a research fellow at the Dayan Center for Research on Islam and the Middle East. He was also the Golda Meir Fellowship Scholar at Hebrew University of the Institute of Judaic Studies. And he was, I'm going to mess up this name, sorry, there's actually a few German speakers here. The Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin's Institute for Advanced Study, and he was also at the University of Pennsylvania's Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies. And he's the author of a book that was this came out in 2007 from Stanford University Press, entitled Between Foreigners and Shiites, 19th Century Iran and its Jewish Minority. So it's really a pleasure to have Daniel here with us today.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Dr. Charles Moore for inviting me. Can you hear me? Okay. It's a well-known fact that some elements in the Islamic Republic of Iran exhibit anti-Semitic tendencies. To better understand the rise of these tendencies, I would like us to see them in historical perspective and briefly offer some four factors as background to their emergence. So factor number one would be the following: the attitude of Islam as well as Muslim legal concepts pertaining to the Jews. In the year 651, Iran was conquered by Islam. The approach of Islam and Muslims toward the Jews was based on various factors. One, Muhammad's attitude towards the Jews, at first trying to befriend them, later attacking them and expelling 2 Jewish tribes from his city, as well as massacring the men of the third tribe. 2, Quranic perceptions. The Quran includes positive statements about the Jews as well as negative statements. We can speak about these issues later on. 3, Hadith, oral traditions, Muslim oral traditions, perceptions on the Jews. Some of them are positive, many others nevertheless are negative on the Jews. 4, polemical literature written about the Jews, consisting of the following elements. 1, viewing the Hebrew Bible as a divine text that had been abrogated in the face of a more complete and perfect revelations, including Islam. 2, the Hebrew Bible as forged by the Jews. 3, the Hebrew Bible as predicting the rise of Islam and Muhammad. All these are found in the same texts written by Muslims. A 5th element, under the first factor of mind dealing with Islam, is precedents developed during the conquest of Islam that were adopted by schools, by the different scholars of the different schools of law in Islam. All above, all these 5 issues are quoted nowadays, very much remembered and learned by Muslims, contemporary Muslims. The Jews, as well as some other religious minorities, are recognized as the people of the book, meriting protection or dhimma in exchange for their acceptance of certain conditions that demonstrated their submission to Muslim rule, their recognition of Islam's superiority, and their dishonor. The dhimma consisted of a set of stipulations which included the prohibition of constructing new houses of worship and of riding on saddles. The dhimmis were obligated to wear all clothes that differed from those of Muslims. Still, compared to the status under the Sasanian government before Islam, the status of the Jews improved under Islam in Iran. Jews now received protection dictated by the Sharia, the law of Islam. The arrival of the Safavid dynasty to power over Iran in the early 16th century marked a turning point in the history of Iran in general and in the history of its religious minorities in particular. Under the Safavids, Shiism became the state religion, state religion. In the like manner of Sunni Islam, Shiism viewed the people of the book residing under Islam as dhimmis, and Jews were included in this status. Nevertheless, Shiism has some unique characteristics in this regard. So you can see dhimma is there, but there are some unique elements. A hallmark of Shi'i treatment of religious minorities is the concept of najasat, or impurity. According to this concept, religious minorities, among them the Jews, were perceived as impure, whose touch defies the Shi'i believer. This concept of impurity became ubiquitous and had a tremendous impact on the Jews' lives and daily interaction with larger Shi'i society. It helped segregating the Jews and was used as a pretext for barring them entrance to the local marketplaces, bazaars of certain cities. Other issues included this issue of food. Jews, let me put it like that, Shiites were not allowed to consume any food, or all kinds of food that were produced by the Jews. Only fruits and vegetables, as long as they did not come in touch with water, were allowed for Shiites to consume. The third element is the issue of marriage. Whereas Sunnis allow Muslim men to marry women from the people of the book, including Jewish women, Shiites restrict this issue and argue that only a certain type of inferior type of marriage is allowed for Muslim men with women coming from the people of the book, Jews included, and this is the type of marriage called muta or sireh, which is temporary marriage. A Muslim man, comes to a woman and signs a contract getting married with her for a certain limited time period. So this type of marriage is seen as inferior, and this inferior type of marriage, inferior to the potentially eternal type of marriage, regular type of marriage, only this type of marriage is allowed with women from the people of the book. Indeed, these concepts apply to the people of the book at large, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, etc. Not only to the Jews. Still, Jews, like other religious minorities, are seen as inferior to Muslims, and we have to keep this in mind. So this was factor number one as far as I'm concerned. Muslim views, or specifically Shiite attitude towards the Jews. Moving from the legal concepts pertaining to the Jews to the real-life situation, I'd like to introduce factor number two. In the reality of Jewish life under the Safavids, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, Jews would be many times harassed, persecuted, sometimes even forcibly converted to Islam. Nevertheless, as opposed to some scholars who would actually draw a line between Shi'i treatment towards the Jews and these persecutions, arguing that Jews would be persecuted because of the Shi'i concepts that I just mentioned, I would like to argue that Shi'ism was indeed at the background, but Shi'ism cannot really explain all attacks against the Jews. Jews will be attacked in Safavid times due to economic tension, as well as some internal rifts within the community that later on only draw the attention of the Muslim government, meaning not everything should be ascribed to Shiite religious hatred against Jews. Keep this in mind. By the end of the 18th century, in 1796, the Qajar dynasty took over and reigned supreme over much of Iran. Under the early Qajars, 1796 to 1848, Jews suffered from occasional persecution and regular abuse, including blood libel accusations. At times, Jews were forcibly converted to Islam, as was the case with the well-known conversion of the Jewish community of Mashhad in 1839. The Jews of Mashhad led crypto-Jewish life for generations to come following 1839. Actually, for 150 years, Jews in Mashhad lived openly as Muslims, but at home as Jews. We can speak about that later on. There are many stories about this issue. Indeed, all these persecutions and abuse during early Qajar times apply to other people of the book and not only to the Jews. Zoroastrians suffered, Christians suffered, and not necessarily only the Jews. Still, in some cases, it seems that the Jews were regarded as inferior to all other religious minorities, and I'd like to quote for you some quotes. This we have it in front of us already. This line is actually, the paragraph here that you see is a quotation from the Shah's physician in the early 19th century. As you can see, he says the Jews are, in the scale of God's creatures, the lowest of white beings. They are the leprosy of creation. They are the degree above dogs. We kill a Jew and say no blood is spilled. They are the abandoned of Allah. Who cares for a Jew more or less? Another quote, which I don't have in front of you here, I didn't really write it down in front of you, but I'm going to quote it for you, is from a certain Shiite religious scholar, again early 19th century, who states that the Jews, quote, in all cities and countries are despised and not honored, especially under the Shiite Imami creed. So says the Shiite religious scholar. They are extremely subdued and far from any degree of honor. So we have to keep that as well in mind. Some change in the legal status and daily situation of the Jews can be discerned from the latter part of the 19th century onward, largely due to foreign intervention. Right, so we can see that certain foreign Jewish organizations like the Anglo-Jewish Association, the Jewish Board of Deputies in London, Alliance Société Universelle in France, as well as figures like Moses Montefiore, as well as great powers, France, but mostly Britain, would actually speak on behalf of the Jews. In 1873, equality is granted to the Jews. All that should be kept in mind. Still, Jews continued to suffer from disabilities that after they were removed from other religious minorities. Not only that they were attacked and attacks continued, but also certain disabilities that were removed from the Jews only after they were removed from other religious minorities, Christians and Zoroastrians. What I'm trying to say is that one gets the sense that the Jews are a kind of a special, more inferior status related to other religious minorities in Iran. I discussed these issues in my book that Charles kindly mentioned. Thus, the situation of the Jews in the 19th century to the early 20th century in Iran usually remained stagnant, and Jews would be still ill-treated and harassed on a regular basis, while occasionally even suffering outbursts of violence. In 1905, there was a major attack against the Jews. 1909, 1910, as you can see in front of you. I discussed these issues in an article I published in Iranian Studies around a year ago. The early years of the 20th century were impacted by Iran's first revolution, the Constitutional Revolution, 1906-1911. The enactments of those years revealed some changes for part of the religious minorities, including the Jews. Some positive developments did take place. The Supplementary Fundamental Laws of October 7, 1907 opens with the following momentous declaration, quote, "The people of the Iranian Empire are to enjoy equal rights before the law," end quote. This was indeed a major break for the Islamic view of the legal rights of non-Muslims. Other lines, other statements during that time actually abolished the taxes, the specific taxes imposed only on Jews and other religious minorities, the jizya. Jews received representation in the parliament around that time. Nevertheless, still other enactments of the same time period were less forthcoming. For instance, only Muslims could be ministers. Jews, among other religious minorities, were not completely welcome to Iranian society, and indeed onslaughts continued. 1909 Kermanshah, 1910 Shiraz. Onslaughts mean attacks, massacre, killing, raping, looting, plundering the Jewish community. Addressing the Jews' place in Iranian eyes, we so far briefly mentioned two factors. One, the attitude of Islam, mainly Shiite Islam, towards the Jews. Two, the actual approach of Iranian society towards the Jews from the 16th century to the early 20th century. Both factors have a long-standing impact on contemporary attitudes towards the Jews and Judaism in Iran, so we have to keep this in mind, both of them. Entering the 20th century, two further factors should be borne in mind. Number three, the introduction of European concepts of anti-Semitism. Four, political factors among which the establishment of the State of Israel. So let me move with factor number three. As shown by Sarur Sarudi, the late Sarur Sarudi, a teacher of mine, secular nationalism was one aspect of Western thought that began attracting some Iranians already during the 19th century. Secular nationalism found expression in two different directions. One, a liberal direction that was actually forthcoming to religious minorities. Another direction was held by some intellectuals that highlighted the pure, quote-unquote, pure Iranian elements in their own identity. Arabs and Islam, that were seen as the primary foreign reasons underneath Iran's decline, were regarded, according to this line, as Semite, whereas Europeans and their civilizations were seen as Aryan. The followers of this trend read the linguistic divisions of languages into Turkic, Semitic, and Indo-European in racial terms, which allowed them to dissociate themselves from the Semitic and Turkic stocks. Such concepts found currency under the Pahlavi regime. Reza Shah Pahlavi, this is the fellow in front of us, ruling in between 21/5 to 41. He came to power in 25 actually made himself a Shah. Founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, was first and foremost committed to modernizing Iran, constructing railroads and factories, enlarging the bureaucracy, strengthening the army, and investing in the education, agriculture, and industry of the country. The ideology for this enterprise was nationalism, secular nationalism. Secular nationalism came at the expense of Islam, and this was good for the Jews, because now, much more than before, the Jews were perceived as Iranians, whose religious persuasion was their own private affair. And indeed, just in a line, I should say that some Jews started to really get better positions and become part of society in different ways. This process, however important, should not be overrated, as simultaneously Reza Shah's regime increased the racial awareness of the Iranian people by emphasizing and glorifying pre-Islamic Iran, pre-Islamic times. Some Iranian intellectuals and authors, occasionally under the influence of Arthur de Gobineau, emphasized the Aryan extraction of the Iranians, thereby asserting that those who are not Aryans, such as the Jews, were not included in the reawakening nation of Iran. Furthermore, the Iranian regime under Reza Shah approached Nazi Germany. From 1936 onward, hundreds of Germans disguised as tourists arrived annually in Iran. German lecturers, teachers, and experts came to Iran to teach. Nazi lecturers were sent to speak on the supremacy of the Aryan race. In 1936, the Nazi regime declared that the Iranians are pure Aryans, thereby exempting them from the Nuremberg laws of a year earlier. In 1937, the head of the Iranian parliament, Esfandiari, even visited Hitler. By 1940, Germany's share in Iran's foreign trade had reached some 45.5%, more than any other foreign country. Iran became the refuge place for the pro-Nazi former premier of Iraq, Rashid Ali Galayani, and for Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem. Bahram Shah-Rokh, the Zoroastrian Iranian Nazi broadcaster of the Berlin Persian broadcasts, used to vilify the Jews. He exposed the supposed Jewish origins of influential figures in Iran and emphasized the superiority of the Aryan race. By 1946, one expert of Iranian studies could argue that to some extent the Jewish situation was then worse than in the past. In the past, one's religious affiliation was the single most important factor determining one's status. Consequently, a Jew could convert to Islam and upgrade his or her own status and become part of the majority. Now in 1946, by contrast, the most important factor was one's race. Conversion to Islam would not make much of a difference, as a Jew was a Semite even after conversion to Islam. This racist rhetoric could only invite pressure on the head of the Jews, and indeed, anti-Semitic outbursts were seen, as recorded by the late Amnon Netzer. For instance, in Passover 1946, the Jewish community of Rasht, northern Iran, faced a blood libel accusation. Please note, it's Passover, again the same well-known accusations of the Jews as supposedly using the blood of innocent kids for baking their matzah. Similar allegations were made in 1947 and 48 in Persian newspapers, so that was rather common. Following the ousting of Reza Shah in 1941, various parties came into being, some of them with racist tendency and overt anti-Semitic ideology. One of these parties, Sumka, headed by Dr. Monshizadeh, argued the following. Dr. Monshizadeh, in one of his books, argued the following: that the Juhuds, which is a kind of a pejorative term referring to Jews in Persian, Juhuds, the Juhuds can establish their state. We will have some correct relations with the eastern state of Israel, but we will not allow the Juhud to be or become Iranian. End quote. In the latter part of the 20th century, following the fourth factor comes, starts to play its role, and let us speak about that. In the latter part of the 20th century, anti-Jewish feelings were harbored in addition to the above factors, three above factors, due to political reasons. The establishment of Israel on supposed Muslim lands caused Muslims at large, including Shiites, to get involved in the question of Palestine in all sorts of ways. One example is that in 1947, Ayatollah Abu Qasem Kashani, a well-known Ayatollah, called upon Muslims to join their brethren in fighting in Palestine against this developing, newly almost emerging state of Israel. The ever-growing Arab-Israeli conflict influenced in other ways as well. The conflict was seen by some Muslims through religious lenses, as a conflict between Muslims and Jews, Islam and Judaism. In this context, Jews and Judaism were criticized and defamed as constituting an old problem already from the rise of Islam, from the days of Muhammad, with whom I mentioned earlier on. Regarding the teachings of the past, as a role model, an example for the present, these Muslims read their own earliest sources, Quran, Hadith, and so on, in the light of the present conflict. As a matter of fact, the contemporary concern over Palestine-Israel leads this branch of Muslims to distort the past. In reading the Quran, they would focus on those verses, and only on those verses, that depict the Jews in a negative way, while ignoring some positive statements of the Jews. One of the sentences they love quoting is in chapter 5, verse 82, لَتَجِدَانَ أَشَدَ النَّاسِ عَدَاوَةً لِلْيَهُودِ. You are going to surely find that the worst enemies of Islam are the Jews and the polytheists. So these days they love quoting this line, while again ignoring the other positive statements about the Jews, and there are some positive statements about the Jews. Even serious Muslim religious scholars, such as the late Allama Muhammad Hussein Tabatabai, who died in 1981, occasionally connect between the Jews of Mosaic times, or of Muhammad's time, and the Jews of the 20th century. Following Quranic verses, Tabatabai occasionally deals in his 20-volume Quranic commentary with the Jews. In some places, he does not address the Jews mentioned in the Quran only, but moves on to offer his own thoughts on contemporary Jews, thereby drawing a line between the past Jews, past Jews' negative characteristics as seen in the Quran, and that of contemporary Jews. And I have some examples with that, and speak about that later on. Reading the present into the past, that is distorting the past, is demonstrated in the recently produced film Yusuf Payambar. The story, and this is part of it. The story of the prophet Joseph, his dreams and his imprisonment, and later preeminence in Egypt. In one episode, the sons of Jacob fight a Canaanite boy over his land. Jacob then rebukes his son, stating that before the children of Israel, that is his own son, came to Canaan, there were that in that land of Canaan other people who owned the land. This, I would argue, seems to be a latent reference to the contemporary conflict over the land of Canaan, Palestine, Israel. Furthermore, this is still not anti-Semitism, but the following would be. Furthermore, Judah, the forefather of the Jews, is depicted in a very negative light in the film. He is the mastermind behind, according to the film producers, he's the mastermind behind Joseph's selling. He beats him up severely in a kind of a very ugly way, I should say. He never fully regrets his supposed misdeeds towards Joseph. At the end of the movie, the very last line of the movie, the producers of the movie put in Judah's mouth a sentence that indicates that the children of Jacob will be called Jews, in the future, thereby making a clear connection between Judah's negative image throughout the film and the later Jewish people. That's a very long series, some 10 hours. It's some 45 episodes. Highly interesting piece describing this biblical story along Shiite lines, which is very interesting, I should say. Khomeini, the real founder of the Islamic Republic in Iran. Before the revolution, Khomeini used to say that the Jews challenged Islam from its inception, disseminated anti-Muslim propaganda, or that the Jews want to take over the economy of the world, all well-known anti-Semitic arguments. In his later statements, he made a distinction between Jews and Zionists. Jews, according to this line, are protected under Islam, while Zionists are attacked by Khomeini. This distinction is often, but not always, taken by Iranian officials. Okay. Speaking about anti-Semitism, obviously in Iran, one should really examine, at least briefly, the attitude towards the state of the Jews, the Jewish state of Israel, and whether the attitude of Iran towards this Jewish state should be seen as anti-Semitism or not. I'll speak about that very briefly. So first of all, the authorities, Iranian authorities, as we all know, do not really like Israel. They are anti-Zionist clearly. A well-known sentence of Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, is that Israel should be, and then we have different translations of this line, should be wiped out of the pages of time. If you Google that, you're going to see there's a major controversy in the internet and elsewhere about the exact meaning of it, be this as it may. Some people would argue that it doesn't really mean really killing all of the Jews. We can really put this aside. There are some other very clear indications that they have a problem, obviously, with the Zionist state. Israel is seen as a cancerous tumor, obviously, that should be removed. They call Israel a little Satan, and Satan is always a problem. I remember seeing a kind of a photo and showing a missile on which a line was saying Israel should be destroyed. And it's on a missile, so there are not too many ways to really read this picture. In any event, for Iran, Israel actually constitutes a kind of a tool to advance certain needs and interests. The very existence of Israel actually constitutes a kind of an other, an enemy whose very existence actually unifies, may or can or should unify different parties within Iran. So Iran is a kind of a positive thing to some extent for Iran, because it uses it in order to unify its, the different groups within Iran. Sometimes they use, Iran or Iranian authorities use attacks against Israel in order to advance certain policies, calling on the people to come and vote, just because if you are not voting, you are actually voting for the Zionist regime. There's nothing basically between, there's nothing to really to connect between voting in the parliament, for the parliament, and the Zionist regime, but they would use it again to call people to implement different kinds of policies. Sometimes you get the sense that they attack Israel just because they are afraid sometimes to attack directly the West. So it's better to attack Israel, which is supported by certain Western countries. Obviously, attacking Israel, another element is that attacking Israel gains Iran reputation, name. It presents Iran as a kind of, projects Iran as a kind of a bold state that is willing to say what many other states in the region, in the Middle East, really think, but never really dare saying explicitly. Whereas Israel, like any other community or country, should not be immune of criticism, Iranian attacks on Israel are at least partly based on anti-Semitic argumentation, one of which I'm going to mention now, is that they would argue, or they see the Jews as exhibiting any enmity to Islam since Islam's earliest days. Khomeini was, I guess, one of the first ones to say that from the earliest days of Islam, we have a problem. Islam has a problem, had a problem with the Jews, and then they move a step further to argue that this very fact, the tensions between Jews and Muslims back there in the past, actually explain what's happening today, explains that we have a problem with Israel, and that Israel is an enemy. So Israel is seen as a kind of a continuation, an entity that continues the well-known fights between Jews and Muslims in the past. But more than that, we can come across, maybe before I move on, just a kind of a nice point. Ahmadinejad speaks here. Malbar Israel means death to Israel in Persian. Al-Mawt Israel means death to Israel. In English, they say down with Israel, which I think in English sounds a little bit milder to some extent. But in Persian and Arabic, they are very clear. Al-Mawt Israel, death, Maut, Mavet, like in Hebrew. Malbar Israel, death to Israel. And in English, they project it a little bit differently. Moving on to discuss briefly anti-Semitism, let me say the following. Evidence of anti-Semitism in Iran is abundant in literature, public lectures, films, internet blogs, and by government pronouncements. 1. Anti-Semitic literature. In the slide here, you can see that there are different books, anti-Semitic books that were presented in an international book exhibition in Germany in 2005 by Iran. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion were published in Iran several times in the 1930s and 40s, early 60s, later on in the 70s, and some other various editions since the establishment of the Islamic Republic in Iran, in newspapers and some separate publications. As I guess some of you are aware of, memory in Israel and Washington actually highlighted the fact that emphasis of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and the Jews' attempt to take over Iran and dominate the world are seen in, as well as genocide humanity, are seen in the Iranian TV series called The Secret of Armageddon, Part 1, Part 2 from 2008, 2009 or so. 2. Second element, anti-Semitic lecture. Beyond the literature, some figures disseminate anti-Semitic ideas in their speeches and public lectures. Dr. Hassan Abbasi is an Iranian political analyst, the head, or at least used to be the head for some time, the head of the Center for Doctrinal Analysis in the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, as well as, for some time, a theoretician in the office of the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, and, again, for some time, an advisor to President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. In some of his lectures of recent years, Dr. Abbasi argues that various empires of the past were controlled by the Jews. More specifically, he says that the Jews controlled the Achaemenid Empire 559 to 330 before the Common Era, as learned, he argues, from the biblical book of Esther. Two of the most important figures of this, in this empire, the Achaemenid Empire, were Jews, Esther and Mordechai. Dr. Abbasi emphasizes that by the Jews' story, and he says, not by Ahmadinejad's story or by the Hezbollah main story, but by the Jews' stories, there occurred a massacre, Rat Le'am, he says, of some 75,000 Iranians, he calls them, at the hands of the Jews. And then he offers the following line, Holocaust Ya'ane im. This is the meaning of Holocaust, he says. Abbasi also argues that the Jews, Esther and Mordechai, pushed the king of the time to attack Athens, as exactly they did with the Mongols. They pushed the Mongols also to attack Islam. The third element is anti-Semitic films. I just mentioned Yusuf Payambar, the Prophet Joseph, as well as The Secret of Armageddon, Part 1, Part 2. Let's move to number 4. Following Ahmadinejad's rise in 2005, there are increasingly seen in the blog sphere Iranian anti-Semite blogs and internet publications. Some of these blogs focus on Muslim religious and arguments and sources. According to Hamid Tehrani, some of these blogs, quote, some of these bloggers cite a single verse of the Quran, which is this verse which I actually mentioned a minute ago: the Jews and infidels are the worst enemies of Muslims. I'll give you some examples from some of these blogs. One blog argues that the Jews wanted to kill Abdullah, the father of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, so Muhammad will never be born. According to another blog, this blog actually attempts to find hidden Jews, arguing that Muammar Gaddafi of Libya is actually a Jew. Along the same lines, there are some arguments arguing that Ahmadinejad is of Jewish origins. Obviously, the very attempt to associate a person or argue that a person is of Jewish descent is in itself an indicative of anti-Semitism, because by doing that, they actually did attempt to discredit him. And this attempt is not it's not a new phenomenon. Already in the 8th century, there was a certain Arab writer, Al-Muthanna, that some other Arab writers disliked because he was really laughing at their origins, etc. And then they started to argue that he's Jewish. So this is a kind of a common theme. Other blogs love dealing with Hollywood movies. In one internet article asserts that Hollywood the Hollywood is in the hands of the Jews. It specifies names of numerous actors and producers who are, according to this base, Jews. One blog says that Harry Potter books and movies try to give a positive image of witchcraft. The blogger claims that witchcraft may be contrary to Islam and Christianity, but is attractive to the Jews, which explains why Jews would have some interest in really advancing this type of movies. Another blog argues that Mickey Mouse movies depict Mickey Mouse in a positive way. Why? Because Jews were used to be seen in Europe as rats. So in order to change their image, Mickey Mouse came into being. 5. Anti-Semitic government pronouncements. Following the line of some of his predecessors, most notably the Supreme Leader Khamenei, and in common with certain blogs, President Ahmadinejad has emphasized time and again from different podiums that the mass killing of millions of Jews during the Second World War, the Holocaust, is a myth. Now we have some other examples for the same line. In December 2006, Iran hosted a convention that officially wished to examine whether indeed millions of Jews had been killed. November 2009, Muhammad Ali Ramin, a Holocaust denier, was appointed to the Vice Minister of Culture in Iran. He said to have argued that the Jews are the reason for maladies worldwide and that Hitler was Jewish. Most recently, in August 2010, an internet site in Persian, which was also translated to some other languages, presented the Holocaust cartoons, which is actually based on a 2008 book of cartoons. And some other sites every now and then are seen or argue similar, come up with the anti-Semitic arguments. What is the meaning of Iran's Holocaust denial? So as argued by Meir Litvak, by denying the Holocaust, denial of the Holocaust actually allows Iran to attack the basis on which Israel was established. So Iranians believe that Israel is based on, that the Holocaust is a founding myth of Israel, so if we deny the Holocaust, the entire state of Israel has no reason to exist. Additionally, again argued by Professor Litvak, quote, under the pretext of the fabrication of the Holocaust for the sake of Zionism, Iran distorts and denies Jewish history and deprives the Jews of their human dignity by showing the greatest tragedy as a fraud, even though the Holocaust has nothing to do with the Zionism per se, end quote. So these two arguments, I'd like to offer two more of my own. Actually, denying the Holocaust allows Iran to attract other anti-Jewish states and societies to Iran's camp, supporting Iran's stand on other fronts. For instance, Iran's nuclear drive, meaning by practically attacking Jews and exhibiting anti-Semitism, it's clear that other groups, which are actually other societies, other states, which seem to think the same thing, would be attracted to Iran, and this attraction to Iran would be used by Iran to forge a kind of a strong alliance, supporting Iran on other fronts, for instance, the nuclear issue. A fourth possible incentive that should be mentioned is that denial of the Holocaust as well as attacking of Jews and Judaism serves sometimes as a kind of a very easy way to attack the West or Western countries for whom the Holocaust is an event whose existence cannot really be questioned. To conclude, anti-Semitic feelings and imagery were not always common in Iran. 20th and 21st century's expressions of anti-Semitism are reflective of the following. One, certain limited Muslim, specifically Shiite perceptions of the people of the book, including the Jews, not only the Jews. Two, it's reflective of past treatment and the denigrating approach and imagery towards the Jews among other religious minorities, seeing them as filthy, liars, unworthy of trust, and more. Three, it's reflective of introduction of European races, especially anti-Semitic ideology. Four, it's reflective of political concerns of the fate of Muslim lands in their facing what is regarded as an imperialist onslaught on Islam. And it's also reflective specifically of political concerns over the fate of Palestine, Israel. Anti-Semites in Iran consists of some government officials. Ahmadinejad is an excellent example, but also of some of their adversaries from the protest movement, as well as certain members of society as seen in their blogs. That is, anti-Semitism is apparently a rather broad phenomenon in Iran nowadays. I don't have figures or anything like that, but that's the feeling. Nevertheless, not all Iranians espouse such beliefs. Some of them view the Holocaust as a fact, as well as reject common anti-Semitic themes. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much, Daniel. I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the first question.
Please.
Thank you very much for your overview. From a religious perspective, the relationship of the regime of Iran to Israel, is it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is of great concern to them? Can you kind of look at it from a religious perspective? Is it possible for Jews, given who and how they're perceived religiously, can the self-determination of the other, of non-Muslims on Islamic land, of Jews, be acceptable from a religious perspective, from the perspective of religion as put forth by Ayatollah Khomeini, who's the founder of the revolution, but even before the revolution? Is there space to accept the self-determination of Jews on Islamic land from a Shiite religious perspective?
So I can summarize it as far as I can say. If we are indeed to focus on Khomeini and his ilk, you would say no. That's it. So it makes my job very easy. Religiously speaking, a Muslim that follows the line of Khomeini, that espouses this type of Islam, would obviously not accept any entity on Muslim soil. And Palestine, Israel is seen as a Muslim soil, so no others can really have anything to do with Palestine. Actually, Khomeini himself argues, but this is not a religious argument, but he does argue that Israel was planted in the midst of a Muslim lands and societies and states in order to somehow undermine Islam from within. So he actually views this entire fight religiously. Religiously speaking, he sees a problem with the state of Israel. He is obviously the major ideologue there, even before him. It's not exactly his own new innovation. We are aware of some connections between certain Iranian figures, and I mentioned Ayatollah Kashani, who died in 1962. Him with Muslim brothers, some of these figures, religious figures, already in the 30s, 40s, had some relations with the Muslim brothers in Egypt, for instance, nowadays in the news. So religiously speaking, there's a problem here, no doubt. So if we are to focus only on the religious differences back there in Palestine and Israel, there's a problem for future generations as well as for our generation. If we focus on supposedly arguing that the conflict there is only a conflict over land, resources, water, etc., there maybe there's some solution out of it. But religiously speaking, there's a kind of a gap, a major gap here. Islam would not accept a non-Muslim state, a non-Muslim entity in its midst. The maximum granted by Islam to religious minorities is protection, dhimma, which one may argue is a lot, and indeed in some cases it did protect the Jews. I should be very clear-cut on that. Nevertheless, that's the maximum granted to religious minorities, including the Jews. Beyond that is going against Allah, basically.
So thank you very much. Just as a footnote, there's some great news that just came out of Washington today. So James Clapper, the head of the National Security Intelligence of the United States, said that the Muslim Brotherhood gave up violence and is a secular movement. So it's great news. Any questions? Uriel and then Professor Reyes.
I was just wondering what your thoughts were about the Jews currently living in Iran and the conditions facing them. There are about 20,000 Jews, and Ahmadinejad consistently makes the claim that it's equal, it's great because they have a representative in parliament.
Right.
So, what are your thoughts on that?
Good question. In the last 30 years, basically, when the Iranian Revolution took place, was successful in 1979 or so, some Jews were executed. The head of the Jewish community there, Habib al-Ghanayan, was executed by the regime, supposedly because of really supporting the previous corrupt regime, as well as being Zionist. In the following several decades, some other Jews were executed, which actually worried very much the Jewish community there, causing 2/3 of the community to run away, immigrate, among many other places, to Great Neck, New York, and as well as some other places. Nowadays, indeed, Jews have a representative in the parliament, as well as in the last 3 decades, no doubt. We have to keep it in mind, which is important. Nevertheless, there are some, officially, one cannot argue that they are being discriminated against. I should tell you that some changes were taking place in the last couple of years. For instance, only in 2003-04, a certain law that argued, let me explain the following law. The law is called Diya. Diya means blood money. If the law says basically that if a Muslim kills a Muslim, there are different solutions, one of which is to pay a certain amount of money. How about a Muslim killing a non-Muslim, for instance, a Jew? Shia religious scholars usually argue that the amount paid by a Muslim for killing a Jew is less than the amount paid by the same Muslim killing a Muslim. Only in 2003, this law was changed, actually equating the amount, the blood price. So this is a positive development, no doubt. Another very important law, inheritance law, arguing that if a Muslim dies and he has a non-Muslim relative, the non-Muslim relative takes the entire inheritance at the expense of even the immediate heirs of this non-Muslim person. This law is still intact, which reflects inequality. Putting all this aside, I should really add a further story, I should say. A couple of years ago, 3 years ago, so a relative of mine actually came from Iran, I'm not going to tell where exactly, and visited us in Jerusalem. So I was telling him firsthand what's happening with Ahmadinejad. So he said, it's okay, it doesn't really bother us. We hear about his statements about the Holocaust, we don't like it. The community there even came up with an open letter against such statements. But bottom line, it doesn't do anything to us. Every now and then, again, somebody is captured and accused for being a spy. Like 1999, there were some 13 Jews accused for spying for Israel. Some of them imprisoned for some time and then released. Overall, apparently, it's not too bad. And this relative of mine told me we are doing well. It was before the economic crisis, some 4 years ago or so. So basically, he was let live. His synagogue was functioning. He was even telling me more, that in the times of the Shah, he could be beaten up in the street. Now he walks with his yarmulke, no one touches him. That's what he says. Now I can't tell you that this is reflective of all experiences of the Jews, but we have to keep it in mind. And again, I would argue that Iran is attempting to really treat its own minorities very good in order to gain this positive reputation abroad. We are good to the Jews, we are not anti-Semite. By being good to these 20,000 Jews in Iran, they are practically saying we have nothing against the Jews wherever they are. No, we are good to the Jews, we are actually implementing Islam, offering dhimma, they don't say dhimma, but offering protection and different kinds of rights to the Jews.
So, just a quick addition. You would say that today it's better than it was before the 1979 revolution?
I would not say that. That's what this specific relative, I was rather shocked when he said that, honestly. I would not say that, no. Obviously, there's a reason for why 2/3 of them left. And again, every now and then somebody is captured, you're a spy. They live, I think, I teach in the Yeshiva University, and there are some boys there, I guess in your age or so, early 20s or so, coming from Iran these days. And when I talk to them, they say there's no future there. Yes, no pressure, really immediate pressure, but everybody realizes, especially the young generation, that there is no future there. Among other reasons, because they'd like to get married and there are no girls around in the right age, etc., etc.
I have two questions. One is, what is there in Shia religion, as opposed to Sunni, that makes the Sunnis less disposed against the Jews in the Shia? The second question is, you didn't really talk very much about the Mossadegh period and the start of the Shah. How did that work? He was quite a liberal guy, Mossadegh, and then was taken over by with our help, the Shah,
Right.
the second Shah. So I wonder, you didn't say anything about the attitude towards the Jews during those two periods.
Of Mossadegh, and which, what was the other?
The Shah, he was replaced by
Right,
the second Shah.
right. Okay. About Shia versus Sunnah, reasons for their hatred towards the Jews are, hating more the Jews than the Sunnis. I'm not sure we can really generalize that. Indeed, in law, while dealing with certain legal concepts, you get the sense that the concept of impurity is not followed by Sunnis, usually. And indeed, that can serve, that can really support your assumption. Nevertheless, if you take certain Muslims nowadays, they are no less Jew haters or haters than Shiites. Bin Laden, for instance, certain Islamist groups are really major enemies of Jews and Judaism. Now, about the second issue, the days of the Shah, the second Shah, that these days from 1941, following the overthrow or the ousting of his father, to 1979, in many respects were the best days for the Jews, one of the best time periods for the Jews ever, as opposed to what this relative of mine said. Overall, that was a major window of opportunity for Jews as well as some other minorities. The Shah initiated a series of reform known as the White Revolution, investing in the industry, agriculture, etc., education, and Jews were welcome to participate in these major sweeping changes. But the focus was not on their religion or religious persuasion, etc., but on their talents. And indeed, I'll give you some figures indicating how good was it. In 1976, for instance, there's a figure saying that there were 600 Jewish physicians in Iran, which actually was, percentage-wise, 6% of the physician population in Iran. And you have to keep in mind that the Jews at that time were only less than a quarter of percent out of the entire population. Similar comparison or percentage is given with reference to Jewish professors in institutions of higher learning and the academia, etc. We have some 80 Jewish professors at that time, around that time. And again, constituting what? Some 4% of the entire body of professors in Iran at that time. And again, this is a lot more than a quarter of percent which they figured in society at that time. They were doing well. This is the time period in which some of them got really billionaires, basically. And this would actually lead some of them to have some mixed feelings about society. They were Jews, no doubt, committed to Judaism, no doubt. However, at the same time, very much Iranian, highly acculturated into Iranian society. And you can find some of them, come across some of them in America nowadays. So these days they celebrate the Iranian New Year, Nowruz, in the 21st of March, around that time. They have Iranian names. They are really proud. They were and they are still very proud of their Iranian background. which actually, again, presents us with a kind of a very interesting case. The very fact that the regime was more or less allowing the Jews to participate, with a few exceptions and certain limitations, allowed them to feel so much part of society at that time. The few exceptions I'm just hinting at is the fact that Jews could not be colonels in the army, Jews could not really reach high positions in certain ministries, and so on and so forth. Everybody would remember them as Jews, no doubt. Even in the army, they would be drafted into the Iranian army, which is a lot, I should say. Because according to Islam, a Jew cannot really gear the sword or hold a weapon and somehow be part of the armed forces of the army in a Muslim state. Now, under both the father Muhammad Reza Shah as well as the son Reza Shah, Jews would be drafted to the army. My father was in the Iranian army. At the same time, again, the picture is not completely positive, because at the same time I can tell you that an uncle of mine was in the army, tells me that he had a label on his chest saying, giving his first and last name, and then indicating Kalimi. Kalimi is a nice way to refer to Jews in Iran. Kalima is a word in Arabic. Kalimullah is the one who spoke with God. That's a reference to Moses. And those who follow Moses are called Kalimi basically. So there was an indication on his chest that he is Kalimi. Meaning, what I'm trying to say is that he was actually drafted to the army. That's a major development and a positive development. Still, society never forgets. The army or the officers, the administration, the authorities never forgot, never really wished to really completely forget one's religious persuasion. He was Jewish.
I have also two questions. Does the Iranian state recognize also ethnic and national minorities, not only religious minorities? And the second question concerns Holocaust denial. Is it an element of an official educational system like history teaching? Do they teach the Holocaust denial at schools?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of that. I know that the image of the Jew I don't think that they have a kind of a class or anything like that. But Jews, while teaching on Islam, are all over. You know, again, let me take you back. It's not a coincidence I mentioned Muhammad from the beginning. All these stories are very much vivid in their memories, and especially in a Muslim state that officially actually speaks about Islam as its religion, attempt to propagate Islam, etc. In any class of history, you would come across the Jews, no doubt about that. Why is that? Because Muhammad had some contacts with the Jews. He killed one Jewish tribe, a man of a certain Jewish tribe, Banu Qurayza, and exiled to other Jewish tribes, Qaynuqa, Nadir. They would come across Jews all throughout, and even before, speaking about story and history, when in classes of religion, they would have to come across Jews. Jews are mentioned in the Quran. So if they teach religion, they have to speak about the Jews, because the Quran deals with the Jews in different ways. If they teach oral traditions, hadith, they have to say something about the Jews. If they teach history, they have to say something about the Jews. So I'm not really sure. I can't tell you whether they have a class called Holocaust denial, but obviously prejudice against the Jews is there, no doubt.
No, what I mean is that when they come to the Second World War and the Holocaust, what do they say then?
I can't tell you. I don't really want to say anything. I believe that some of them will follow this official line, but I suspect that some would not. But I can't tell you, so that's only my speculation.
You keep on referring to events in the past and the present. I'm wondering if it isn't necessary to come up with a philosophical view, and that is that there's a clash of civilizations between the West and Islam. They see history differently. They see history as persistent metaphysical truths which keep on recurring as metaphors, and events therefore of then and now connect. I was looking, this summer I was studying Islam and the Quran, and it appeared to me that it's very different from the Torah, from the Jewish concept of linear time. Their time is quite different. They see it essentially as again and again and again. So there's more. Well, next week there's going to be a presentation on, I guess, DNA in Islam. But the question that I'm raising is this. doesn't one need a broader concept of what's happening in Iran to tie in with what's happening in the Muslim mind, essentially, of persistent truths, so that the Jews become the eternal enemy over time, and that what took place during Muhammad's time is taking place now. And it's a different concept, a different way of constructing history. If one sees history in that way, then what is being done is quite reasonable, because they are carrying out the metaphysical truths. What the West is doing is, the West sees the change coming in and doesn't see that as metaphysical truth.
I would argue that indeed the past is very much vivid in their minds, no doubt. There's an attempt to somehow, Muslim views of the past is that the past somehow was led astray, if you will. Meaning the golden age, golden era was in the times of Muhammad. From that moment, and there are different arguments when exactly, there's a war, civil war, the first civil war in Islam, maybe the Shiite-Sunni split that took place there. From these moments, around the 7th century or so, Islam is not really following the right course of history, and we really need to bring it back while imitating this golden era. However, I would not really, I dare differing from your view. I can't speak about a Muslim mind exactly, and I don't think the Jew is an eternal enemy per se. The Jew, mostly in the recent century or so, became a kind of an enemy in many respects because of the fight in Palestine / Israel. In previous generations and previous centuries, when Christianity actually challenged Islam, they would attack much more the Christian world than the Jews. The Jews were meaningless, basically. They would speak about them, deal with them, teach about them, but now there's a kind of an urge, a political urge to really focus on them, which we have to keep in mind.
So, Holger, but before, just as a point, Jewish sense of history, or the Torah sense of history, is not linear either. You have Abraham putting on tefillin before Egypt. You have Jews living holidays. So I don't want to get into it, but the Torah is not a linear sense of history either.
Yeah. I've got two questions. I'm wondering about the strictness of the Shia construction of Iran right